Why did Adolf Hitler fear an American general who never commanded armies in the field, never led a single tank charge, and never fired a shot in anger? Because this man was not simply a soldier, he was the architect of victory. His name was George Catlett Marshall, and his vision transformed the United States from a peacetime nation into the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. When World War II erupted, the global balance of power was collapsing. Nazi Germany was storming across Europe, and Imperial Japan was expanding in the Pacific. The future of freedom itself was in doubt. But in Washington, D.C., a tall, quiet Virginian with a calm voice and steel determination stepped into the spotlight. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt would call him the organizer of victory, and history would prove him right. Marshall wasn't a flamboyant leader. He didn't thrive on dramatic speeches or newspaper headlines. Instead, he was methodical, disciplined, and relentless in pursuit of one goal: to prepare America for the greatest conflict in human history. Hitler, who underestimated so many of his enemies, quickly came to realize that this American general was different. He wasn't fighting battles. He was creating an entire war machine capable of crushing the Reich. In 1939, when the world slid toward chaos, Marshall was appointed Army Chief of Staff. The U.S. Army at that time numbered fewer than 200,000 men. For comparison, Germany's military machine had millions under arms, backed by years of training, doctrine, and combat experience. But Marshall was not intimidated by numbers. He understood that war was no longer just about troops in uniform. It was about industrial power, organization, and the ability to turn a nation's potential into unstoppable force. From his very first day as Chief of Staff, Marshall began to revolutionize the American military. He demanded honesty, discipline, and competence. Officers who clung to old habits were dismissed without hesitation. He promoted new leaders who showed imagination, energy, and the ability to inspire men. Among those he lifted up were names that would become legendary: Dwight Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and George Patton. Marshall had the uncanny ability to spot talent before it was obvious. He didn't care about rank or seniority, he cared about results. And that terrified Hitler because it meant the United States would not be led by mediocrity, but by some of the most capable commanders the war would ever see. But Marshall's genius went beyond personnel. He had a vision of total mobilization. He worked hand in hand with Roosevelt and Congress to expand the Army, to design training programs that could turn civilians into soldiers in record time, and to coordinate with American industry to ensure that every rifle, every tank, every plane that was needed would be built. He knew America's strength was not just in manpower, but in its factories, its engineers, its workers. And he set out to harness all of it. The scale of his ambition was breathtaking. He didn't just want to double the Army, he wanted to multiply it many times over. By the time America entered the war in December 1941, Marshall had already laid the groundwork for an expansion unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Millions of men would be drafted, trained, and deployed. Thousands of planes would roll off assembly lines. Convoys of tanks, trucks, and artillery would cross the oceans. Marshall wasn't reacting to events, he was preparing for them. And the Hitler, who relied so heavily on shock and speed, now faced an adversary who thought in long-term strategy. Marshall also understood alliances. He believed the United States could not win the war alone, but must cooperate with Britain, the Soviet Union, and other nations resisting Axis aggression. He built strong working relationships with Winston Churchill, with British generals, and later with Joseph Stalin's high command. At international conferences, Marshall was the calm, steady voice that explained America's plans, reassured allies, and pushed for decisive action. He never blustered, but when he spoke, others listened. Why was Hitler afraid of him? Because Marshall represented something the Nazi dictator could never match: the full potential of American power, organized and directed with ruthless efficiency. Hitler had counted on the United States being too slow, too divided, too far away to make a difference. He assumed that by the time America could react, Europe would already be under German control. But Marshall shattered that illusion. Within months of the attack on Pearl Harbor, American troops were deploying overseas. Within 2 years, they were fighting in North Africa, in Italy, in the Pacific, and behind them stood an ever-growing arsenal that Marshall had set in motion. Marshall was also fearless when dealing with politics at home. He refused to play games or curry favor. When Roosevelt once asked him for his opinion on a military issue, Marshall gave a blunt answer that contradicted the president's expectations. A silence fell over the room. Then Roosevelt smiled and said, "Well, I guess I have my chief of staff." That honesty, that refusal to bend to politics, made Marshall unique. Hitler's inner circle was plagued by scheming, rivalries, and deceit. Marshall's command was the opposite, unified, disciplined, and focused on victory. He had another quality that made him dangerous to Hitler. He inspired loyalty without demanding it. Officers and soldiers alike respected him not because he sought glory, but because he was fair, competent, and utterly devoted to the mission. He never asked anyone to do what he would not do himself. He worked long hours, often through the night, rarely taking time off. He kept his personal life private, his ego restrained. He was, in many ways, the very opposite of Hitler. Where the German dictator was erratic, egotistical, and driven by ideology, Marshall was rational, selfless, and driven by duty. By 1942, Hitler could no longer ignore the impact of Marshall's leadership. American factories were outproducing the Reich by staggering margins. American soldiers were arriving in Britain by the tens of thousands. The invasion of North Africa, codenamed Operation Torch, showed that the United States could launch massive overseas operations. And behind it all, orchestrating the logistics, the strategy, the coordination, was Marshall. He was the conductor of a symphony of war, and every instrument, Army, Navy, Air Force, industry, was playing in tune. What made Marshall truly formidable was his ability to think globally. While German generals often focused narrowly on campaigns in Russia or North Africa, Marshall was always considering the entire map. He believed that only by opening a second front in Europe could the Allies defeat Hitler. He pushed for the invasion of France long before it finally took place in June 1944. Although he was not chosen to lead the D-Day invasion personally, Roosevelt and Churchill believed he was too valuable in Washington. His fingerprints were all over the operation. The careful buildup of forces in Britain, the coordination of supply lines, the integration of American and British command structures, all bore Marshall's influence. Hitler, who had once dismissed America as a nation of amateurs, now faced a grim reality. Those amateurs had been transformed into professionals at lightning speed. And the man responsible for that transformation was George Marshall. Think of it this way. Patton might win a battle, Eisenhower might command a campaign, but Marshall built the entire system that made those victories possible. He created the conditions for success. He gave his generals the men, the weapons, and the support they needed. Without him, the United States might have stumbled, struggled, or arrived too late. With him, America became the decisive power in the war. Even Churchill, who admired many American leaders, singled out Marshall as the true architect of victory. That phrase was no exaggeration, and it explains why Hitler feared him more than any battlefield general. A general can be beaten in combat, but how do you defeat a man who has created an entire war machine, one that grows stronger every month, every week, every day? George Marshall didn't shout, he didn't boast, he didn't crave headlines, but his calm determination and sweeping vision reshaped the world. By the end of the war, the United States had mobilized over 12 million men and women in uniform, built more than 300,000 aircraft, launched thousands of ships, and supplied not only its own forces, but those of its allies. That miracle of organization, that triumph of planning, was Marshall's legacy. And so, when we ask why Hitler feared Marshall more than Patton, more than Eisenhower, more than any other American general, the answer is simple. Because Marshall was not just a soldier, he was the master strategist of an entire nation at war. When America entered World War II, the nation faced an almost impossible challenge. The Axis powers were at their peak. Nazi Germany controlled nearly all of Europe. Japan had swept across the Pacific. The armies of Britain and the Soviet Union were battered and bleeding. The world waited to see if the United States could rise to the occasion, and the man at the center of that storm was George Marshall. Marshall understood that the war would not be won by isolated victories on the battlefield. It would be won by production, by logistics, and by the ability to sustain a global war effort over years, not months. He knew that modern war was a contest of machines, factories, and supply lines as much as soldiers and generals, and he was determined to make America's industrial power count. The scale of the task was staggering. The U.S. Army in 1941 had just over 15 million men, many of them poorly trained and poorly equipped. Within 4 years, that number would swell to more than 8 million. But Marshall wasn't interested in raw numbers alone. He wanted a force that was modern, mobile, and capable of fighting anywhere in the world. That meant tanks, trucks, aircraft, landing craft, rifles, artillery, radios, everything a modern army required, multiplied on an unprecedented scale. Marshall forged a partnership with American industry unlike anything seen before. Companies that once made cars, refrigerators, and typewriters were retooled to produce jeeps, bombers, and machine guns. Ford built the B-24 Liberator bomber on an assembly line like it was a family sedan. General Motors produced tanks and trucks by the thousands. Shipyards launched new vessels at record speed, sometimes completing a Liberty ship in less than 2 weeks. This was not chaos. It was careful orchestration, and Marshall was the conductor. He worked closely with Roosevelt's administration to set priorities. He made sure that vital resources like steel, aluminum, and rubber went where they were needed most. He coordinated with the Navy and Air Force so that the Army would never find itself starved of support. He insisted on training programs that could take millions of draftees, farm boys, factory workers, college students, and turn them into effective soldiers. And he demanded that the Army learn to move, to fight across oceans, to coordinate with allies. It was Marshall who oversaw the creation of an entire transportation system capable of projecting power across the globe. He understood that victory in Europe would require moving men and supplies across the Atlantic in vast convoys, and that victory in the Pacific would depend on amphibious operations spread across thousands of miles of ocean. That meant logistics on a scale no army had ever attempted. And, under Marshall's leadership, the United States achieved it. By 1943, the numbers were breathtaking. American factories were producing more planes in a single year than Germany had built in the entire war. Tens of thousands of tanks rolled off assembly lines. Millions of rifles, machine guns, and artillery pieces were shipped overseas. The United States didn't just arm its own troops, it became the arsenal of democracy, supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and dozens of other nations fighting the Axis. And Marshall was the man making sure the flow never stopped. Hitler had once boasted that Germany's blitzkrieg was unstoppable. But what he hadn't counted on was Marshall's ability to build a machine of war that could not only match the blitzkrieg, but overwhelm it with sheer scale and relentless momentum. Every time the Germans destroyed an Allied tank or plane, Marshall's system replaced it tenfold. Every soldier lost could be reinforced with a fresh, trained replacement. For Hitler, it was a nightmare with no end. Marshall also recognized the importance of speed. War moves quickly, and delays cost lives. He cut through red tape, eliminated unnecessary bureaucracy, and demanded efficiency. He refused to allow bottlenecks to slow the war effort. When problems arose, he dealt with them immediately, often personally. He had a reputation for being calm, but behind that calmness was an iron will. Factories, generals, politicians, everyone knew that when Marshall gave an order, it was not a suggestion, it was law. At the same time, he never forgot the human side of war. He cared deeply about the welfare of soldiers. He insisted that they be properly trained, properly equipped, and properly supported. He knew that men fighting in distant lands needed more than weapons. They needed food, clothing, medical care, and morale. Marshall's planning included all of it. He didn't just prepare armies to fight, he prepared them to endure. Consider the North African Campaign of 1942. When American troops landed in Morocco and Algeria, it was the first major test of Marshall's system. The operation involved hundreds of ships, thousands of vehicles, and tens of thousands of men, all coordinated across an ocean. It was risky, complex, and unprecedented. And yet it succeeded. Mistakes were made, lessons were learned, but the message was clear. The United States could move armies overseas, supply them, and keep them fighting. Hitler, watching from Berlin, realized the danger. This was only the beginning. As the war progressed, Marshall's system grew stronger. In Italy, American forces pushed north through brutal mountains, supplied by endless convoys and airlifts. In the Pacific, island after island fell as Marines and soldiers advanced, backed by waves of ships, aircraft, and artillery that Marshall's planning had unleashed. And in Britain, the buildup for D-Day was underway, millions of tons of supplies, hundreds of thousands of men, all organized and delivered under Marshall's direction. What set Marshall apart was not just his ability to build armies, but his ability to think strategically about how to use them. He understood that war was not about one battle or one front, but about applying pressure everywhere until the enemy cracked. He coordinated with the Navy in the Pacific, with the British in Europe, and with the Soviets on the Eastern Front. He saw the war as a global puzzle, and he was fitting the pieces together. Hitler hated that. He had counted on America being clumsy, divided, and slow. Instead, under Marshall, America was unified, precise, and fast. Every day, the United States grew stronger. Every day, new divisions trained, new weapons rolled out, new ships set sail. And every day, Hitler's nightmare grew closer to reality. Marshall's mobilization was more than numbers. It was a statement. It told the world that the United States was not a passive player. It was the decisive force. The arsenal of democracy was awake, and it would not rest until tyranny was defeated. For Hitler, this was more terrifying than any single battle. Battles could be lost or won. But how do you fight against an enemy who can replace every loss, who grows stronger with each passing month, who has leaders like Marshall shaping the future with relentless focus? By 1944, America's war machine was operating at full power. The D-Day invasion, the liberation of France, the push into Germany, all of it depended on the foundation Marshall had built. His mobilization had created not just armies, but the infrastructure to support them. And it was that infrastructure, ships, planes, supply lines, factories, that made victory possible. Hitler may have feared Patton's aggression, Eisenhower's calm leadership, or Nimitz's naval brilliance. But above them all, he feared Marshall. Because Marshall represented something Hitler could never control, the unstoppable rise of American power, organized and directed with genius precision. And in the end, that power crushed the Reich. Adolf Hitler feared many things in the last years of his reign. Soviet tanks rolling westward, Allied bombers darkening the skies, the partisans who struck at his armies from the shadows. But among the men who opposed him, one figure stood apart. It was not a battlefield commander like Patton, or a naval genius like Nimitz, or even the Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower. No, the man Hitler feared most was George Catlett Marshall. Why? Because Marshall was more than a general. He was the brain, the architect, the steady hand guiding an entire nation's transformation into a war machine. Hitler could hope to outmaneuver a general in combat. He could never hope to outmaneuver the man who created the entire system of victory. By 1943, Marshall's presence loomed over every decision in Berlin. The Reich's intelligence reports painted a picture of a United States producing tanks, planes, and ships at numbers Germany could never match. Each month, the Americans grew stronger, more disciplined, more determined, and at the center of it all was Marshall, calm, methodical, relentless. Hitler's nightmare was not an American division on the battlefield. His nightmare was an America that could replace every division, every tank, every plane, endlessly. And that was exactly what Marshall had built. Marshall's genius was invisible to the public. Unlike Patton, he did not pose for cameras or give fiery speeches. Unlike MacArthur, he did not cultivate a personal legend. His work was quieter. hidden behind the walls of the Pentagon, in endless meetings, in careful planning sessions, in stern conversations with industrial leaders and political allies. But that quiet work reshaped the world. Hitler prided himself on his ability to sense weakness. He mocked his enemies, ridiculed their leaders, dismissed their armies. But Marshall was different. Even from afar, Hitler recognized the danger. Reports from German intelligence warned that Marshall's organizational skills were unlike anything they had encountered. He was turning America into something the Reich could not defeat, a nation that could wage war on multiple continents simultaneously. Think about that. While Germany struggled to fight on two fronts against the Soviets in the East and the British in the West, Marshall had created a United States capable of fighting across the Atlantic and the Pacific at the same time. No other nation in history had attempted such a feat. Hitler feared Marshall because he understood the scale of that accomplishment. Marshall also terrified Hitler because of his approach to leadership. In Nazi Germany, power was fragmented, generals schemed against one another, and fear poisoned every relationship. In Marshall's America, it was the opposite. Marshall built a team of competent, loyal leaders. He identified Eisenhower as the man who could command the Allied invasion of Europe. He trusted Patton's aggressiveness while keeping him under control. He gave Bradley and others the support they needed to succeed. He didn't micromanage, but he made sure the right people were in the right places. Hitler, trapped in a web of rivalries and mistrust, could only watch with frustration. His generals quarreled, withheld information, and feared his wrath. Marshall's generals worked as a unit, bound by respect and shared purpose. That unity was lethal. It meant that the Allies could adapt, coordinate, and strike with precision. Another reason Hitler feared Marshall was his insistence on the Germany First strategy. After Pearl Harbor, many Americans wanted to focus on Japan, but Marshall, alongside Roosevelt and Churchill, argued that Nazi Germany was the greater threat. He pressed for a massive buildup in Britain, for the eventual invasion of France, and for a clear strategy to defeat Hitler first. Without Marshall's influence, the United States might have scattered its efforts across the globe. With him, it concentrated its might where it mattered most. And when the time came, it was Marshall's system that made D-Day possible. Though he did not lead the invasion personally, every ship, every plane, every rifle that stormed the beaches of Normandy bore his imprint. Eisenhower was the commander, but Marshall was the architect. Hitler feared the landing at Normandy, but more than that, he feared the machine that had made it inevitable. There was another layer to Hitler's fear, Marshall's moral authority. Even Stalin, no admirer of Western leaders, respected Marshall. Churchill called him the true architect of victory. Roosevelt leaned on him constantly. Allies trusted him because he was honest, direct, and utterly focused on the mission. In a war filled with egos, propaganda, and manipulation, Marshall stood apart as a man of integrity. That integrity was powerful. It gave him credibility. It built alliances. It inspired confidence. Hitler, who ruled by lies and terror, had no answer for that kind of strength. Marshall's calmness was itself a weapon. He was never shaken, never flustered. In the darkest days of 1942, when American forces suffered setbacks in North Africa and the Pacific, Marshall did not panic. He adjusted. He learned. He pressed forward. That steadiness reassured Roosevelt, reassured the Allies, and sent a message to the Axis. America would not break. Hitler's strategy often relied on breaking his opponent's will. With Marshall, there was no weakness to exploit. By 1944, the tide had turned. American armies pushed across France. The Soviets crushed the Wehrmacht in the east. The skies above Germany swarmed with Allied bombers. And yet, even then, Hitler raged about Marshall. To him, Marshall represented the unstoppable engine of American war power. Every destroyed tank was replaced. Every fallen soldier was reinforced. Every lost battle only fueled the resolve of a system designed to win. Hitler once said, "The American war machine is like a giant, clumsy body. Strike it hard enough, and it will fall apart." But under Marshall, that body was anything but clumsy. It was efficient, disciplined, and lethal. Hitler realized too late that Marshall had forged something new in the history of warfare. a military-industrial juggernaut that could not be destroyed by force of arms alone. Even after victory, Marshall's influence continued to haunt the defeated Reich. He oversaw the demobilization with the same discipline he had applied to mobilization. He shaped the post-war world through the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe and ensured that the seeds of fascism would not return. Hitler was gone by then, but the shadow of Marshall's work remained. It was not enough for him to win a war. He wanted to secure a peace, and that, perhaps more than anything, showed why Hitler feared him. Marshall was not fighting for glory or for himself. He was fighting for a vision of a world where freedom could endure. So why did Hitler fear Marshall more than any American general? Because Marshall was not just a man. He was a force of history. He turned America into an arsenal that dwarfed the Reich. He built armies that could fight across the world. He chose leaders who would carry out the great campaigns of the war. He gave the Allies the strength, the strategy, and the unity they needed to win. Hitler could face a general on the battlefield. He could not face George Marshall. In the end, the truth is simple. Marshall was the reason the United States could fight, the reason the Allies could triumph, the reason Hitler's empire crumbled. He was the organizer of victory, the architect of freedom, and the nightmare of every tyrant who dares to challenge a free people. And that is why Adolf Hitler feared George C. Marshall more than any other American general.